Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Eric Prado, and I will be your host for today's webinar, J1 Exchange Visitor Program, What You Need to Know. Really excited that everyone can join us for today's event. Before we get to the main presentation, though, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, and we will send you the recording after the presentation concludes, so be sure to keep an eye on your inbox in the coming days for that. The presentation will last for about 40 minutes, and we'll have some time left over for questions and answers throughout the presentation. So if you would like to ask a question, please do so using the question function on the right-hand side of your webinar screen. All right, so for those that are unfamiliar with Envoy, Envoy for nearly 20 years has been on a mission to fix the inefficient, frustrating, and confusing immigration process. We combine expert legal representation with innovative technology to deliver the only platform that makes it seamless for companies to hire, mobilize, and manage a global workforce. We secure work authorization in 150 plus countries, and we've grown 46% year to date, and we work with over 1,000 customers. We are particularly proud of our NPS score, which is a testament to the employee experience that we provide. All right, so today I would like to introduce our presenter. Gordy Rusoclia is a senior associate with Global Immigration Associates, Envoy's affiliated law firm. He has over 7 years of professional experience in immigration matters gained at GIA and previously at Fragonen. Gordy earned his law degree cum laude from the University of Wisconsin Law School in 2010 and his BA cum laude from the College of William and Mary in Virginia. Gordy has extensive professional experience in the immigration field and was recently named a Super Lawyer's Rising Star. He possesses deep expertise in guiding companies through the workforce impacts of corporate restructuring and also serves as a lead attorney for I-9 program implementation and development. Gordy has authored numerous articles in the immigration field, including his most recent titled, Why It Is Time for Congress to Eliminate the Arbitrary H-1B Cap. Gordy is licensed to practice in Illinois and Wisconsin. Gordy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Eric. Great to be with you.
Awesome. And then before I hand it off to Gordy, I just want to provide an overview of today's presentation. So looking at the agenda, Gordy will provide an understanding of the J1 visa, compare it to other visas, and more. Again, after the main presentation, we'll have a few minutes for questions and answers. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Gordy.
Yeah, Eric, thank you so much. So just giving everyone a little bit of background in terms of the J1 visa, it's widely known as the largest public diplomacy program initiative that's been initiated by the Department of State. There are roughly 300,000 J1 visas that are, handed out each year. Sometimes that number can be higher, sometimes it can be less. I believe this past fiscal year is about 375,000. And so most of the J1 visa, why was it developed? Why is it in place? It's supposed to be a cultural exchange. So it's someone receiving training, someone who's based abroad, but they're coming to the U.S. to receive training, whether it's professional training, whether it's just being accustomed more to the American culture. Sometimes you see J1 visas as well, applicable to students, fellows, etc. So we'll talk about that more as we get further into the presentation and distinguishing the J1 visa from other visas. The primary thing to remember here is just that it's meant more as a culture exchange for a temporary period of time of someone coming to the U.S. And there are different categories for the J1 visa that different people can apply for through a program sponsor. Yeah, so here, we see what are the different categories that someone can apply under, as a J1, professors, research scholars, trainees, interns, university students, au pairs. Those are generally people, who are working, an example that I can think of, in seasonal positions, for example, someone working in Colorado, perhaps as a ski resort could potentially have a J1, so just meant more as exchange programs. In terms of the sponsorship, the main form is the DS 2019. That's the one that authorizes the J1 status. And we'll cover this more closely as well on the other side. The main thing to remember is that um, most of the times for J1s, there are two different categories that the person could fall under. The first one is that if they're receiving government funding, so the government of a certain country is saying, okay, we want John Doe from Italy to come to the U.S. and we'll fund that program because John Doe is going to receive certain invaluable skills as a trainee in the U.S. and then he's going to return back to Italy and apply that knowledge. Sometimes, apart from government funding, there could be a J1 who's applying based on certain skills that are missing in that country. Let's say Italy is missing, people who are, highly trained in stem cell research, let's say, and the person comes here as a J1 scholar to gain exposure in that field in the U.S. and apply that knowledge back in Italy. So we'll get into more detail as we go on, but these are the different categories of J1s, and so you can see that there are a lot of different options: student, trainee, au pair, like a worker, a summer worker, exchange programs, etc. So the advantages and the benefits of the J1 visa, certainly, in terms of talent development, in terms of obtaining those skills, it's, what I've discussed, that it benefits not only the U.S. in terms of having the J1 visa holder here in the U.S. Working and applying the knowledge that they have abroad, but also gaining those skills, and that benefits the foreign country as well in terms of that J1 holder obtaining that knowledge. Diversity, certainly, that's very helpful, to the U.S. in general, and a lot of people, are of the belief that there has to, America being a melting pot, that there has to be people from different cultures with different ideas and different exposures. In terms of international leadership development programs, that can apply as well to J1. Someone coming here either to pursue an educational or a work-related program, and then applying those skills as a leader in their foreign country. Not only learning the English language and everything that the U.S. has to offer, but also gaining practical, technical skills that can then be abroad. In terms of joint ventures and new technologies and products, it's those same ideas that we've spoken about, an interplay and interchange of ideas. A lot of the people coming on J1 visas, they're very talented, very skilled people. And so oftentimes they collaborate and they develop ideas with people in the U.S., and that collaboration continues even when they return to their home country. Yeah, so in the next few slides, we'll compare the J1 visa to some of the other visa types that you may be more familiar with. Certainly the H-1B, that's a very common work visa that, a lot of people on the line perhaps have had exposure to. And so what are the distinctions between a J1 and an H-1B? So everyone knows that for an H-1B, one of the requirements is that you have to file a labor conditions application with the Department of Labor, saying, hey, we plan to employ this person in this position, in this work location. And the Department of Labor has to certify, like, yes, okay, you're going to compensate this person at least at the prevailing wage or higher. For J1s, of course, there's no such requirement. So that's, an important distinction as well in terms of the requirements of what someone needs to possess to qualify for an H-1B as well. That, usually the person has to have a bachelor's degree in a field of study that's related to the offered position. J1 can come a little bit prior to that. It's trainees, it's, someone who's yet to complete an educational program. They can definitely qualify for a J1 visa through a program sponsor. And one important, just from a human perspective, and we'll discuss this more on the subsequent slides as well, a lot of the visas in the U.S., H-1B, F-1, for example, they generally don't provide work authorization to the dependents. So an F-2 dependent, which is a dependent to an F-1, or an H-4, which is a dependent to an H-1B, they generally are not able to apply for work authorization. Now, there's a recent exemption to that rule for H-4 spouses of H-1B holders who are very far in the green card process. But in general, one distinct advantage of J1s, one thing that makes people refer to the J1 sort of being a more humane visa is that the J2, the dependent of the J1, the J2 holder, is able to apply for an EAD card through USCIS right away. So, being in J2, that allows you to submit an I-765 application with USCIS and usually get an EAD within about 3 to 4 months. So, yeah. In terms of the H3, so H3 again is another one that you may be familiar with, training programs. The main distinction that I would draw between the two, number one, H3s are very hard to come by. So it's really important to make it clear in an H3 case that the training is not available in the home country. So if someone, let's say, is wanting to come over as a chef or, something of that nature, you have to show like, hey, there's no such training available in the foreign country. And so USCIS might say, really? There's no chef training that you could receive in your foreign country. So J1s, maybe they're a little bit looser. It's that same concept that we spoke about in the beginning of being a cultural exchange. And so H3s in general, they're very hard to come by. USCIS reviews those with very close scrutiny because of that part of the requirement that the training can't be available in a foreign country. So J1 compared to H3 is maybe a little bit of a looser standard, and it allows people to receive more extensive training than they would through an H3, and more importantly, there's no petition that needs to be filed with USCIS. So the J1, once the program sponsor is on board and has met all the requirements of the program, they issue the DS 2019 form to the applicant, to the J1 applicant. The applicant then applies for a J1 visa at a consulate and enters the U.S. Whereas with an H3, you have to petition through USCIS first, get a 797 approval notice through USCIS, of course, pay the USCIS filing fees. So it's a little bit more of a drawn-out process than would be for a J1. Yeah, in terms of L1 company transfer, it's the same, those same concepts that, we've been speaking about. In general, with L1s, unless the company has a blanket L approval notice, petition has to be submitted through USCIS. There's also the requirement of having worked abroad for a qualifying foreign entity in a managerial or specialized knowledge position within 1 year. 1 full year within the 3 years prior to the petition having been filed. So with J1s, obviously there's no such requirement. There's no USCIS petition filing, and there's no requirement that the person work for any specific company prior to coming over to the US as a J1. B1 business visitors, very, very similar. The B1 tends to be more restrictive than what a J1 would be. J1s, in most circumstances, they can work, they can be compensated, and they're sort of more able to engage in hands-on training and perhaps even productive employment, whereas with B1 business visitors, that's not permissible. So permissible B1 business visitor activities are just meeting, conferences, training, things of that nature. So the J1 allows for a broader scope of employment, a broader scope of what one is permitted to do inside the U.S. Yeah, so these next couple slides, they're going to focus on, designated sponsors. So a lot of the people on the line listening to this conference line, they might be wondering like, hey, how do we, what you've covered so far sounds really great. How do we actually employ a J1 employee? Most of the times what you're going to find is that you're not going to be the direct program sponsor, but that you're going to perhaps employ someone who is here on a J1 through a cultural exchange program, and that program sponsor allows that person to work on site at your company. So that's something to be mindful of in terms of just the designated sponsors, what their obligations are. The Department of State, has a host of requirements, in terms of maintaining insurance, in terms of, different, the length of the program, in terms of renewing, in terms of, how long the J1 holder can stay after the program has been terminated. There's a CVIS record, so that's for maintaining records of the foreign nationals once they enter to the U.S. monitoring, what they're doing. Are they continuing with their program? Are they completing the requirements of their program? And so that's what a big part of the J1 program is as well, is that, there are regulations in place that require, them reporting back to the program sponsor to confirm the activity that they're engaging in and what they plan to do in the U.S. Yeah, so the sponsor responsibilities in terms of someone who's an intern or a trainee as a J1. So that's one of the J1 categories. So we've discussed someone being a scholar, someone being an au pair. So what we're speaking about on this slide is someone being an intern or a trainee. So most of the time, for these types of situations, the candidates are screened up front. Before the DS 2019 is issued by the program sponsor, they ask the J1 applicant to provide evidence of their training, whether it's their educational documents, a transcript, a resume, things of that nature, to make sure that they're qualified to engage in this program. And then in terms of maintaining compliance and everything that goes into, there are, healthcare requirements or safety and welfare requirements, providing orientation, providing intercultural information and resources, maintaining a valid CVIS record, which we've discussed. So all of these things, are responsibilities that exist when someone is serving as a J1 program sponsor. Yeah, and so this is the main form, that we've spoken about, the DS 2019. This is the form that is issued to the J1 applicant before he or she goes to the actual consulate to apply for the visa stamp. And so what you'll find on these DS 2019 forms oftentimes is that, toward the top, it'll say, okay, the program sponsor is Cultural Vistas, Inc. And then there'll be additional information that, discusses where the person is being placed. So the idea would be, hey, this is a program, a J1 program sponsor through Cultural Vistas, Inc. And that J1 sponsor is being placed, to work on site, let's say at Microsoft or at Facebook or one of those other companies. So that's a very common arrangement where the actual program sponsor is Cultural Vistas or a different program. Then the actual training and the employment is happening at the actual work site. So this is the main form, the DS 2019 form that's used for I-9 that proves the sponsorship, that reflects the CVIS record, which is up in the corner. So that's, and it also lists the dates of participation in the program. And oftentimes it can be extended. So let's say someone's like, okay, I'm on a J1, my visa stamp and my DS 2019 form are expiring in October 2019. They can speak to the program sponsor and say like, hey, is there any way to get this extended? So host company responsibilities. This is the same thing, so that scenario that we've discussed, like, okay, someone's being sponsored for J1 through Cultural Vistas, but they're being, placed on site at a specific company. That 32-hour per week engagement in the activity, that's significant because they want to keep that as an hourly mark to make sure that that's the main reason that the person is inside the U.S. So let's say someone's here as a J1, but they only engage in the J1 program activities for 15 hours a day. Well, USCIS could say, well, then their main reason for being here in the U.S. is not this J1 program, it's something else. It's whatever they're doing, during all those other hours. So that's why that's an important requirement as well. So taking an active role in planning activities in and out of the office to expose the participant to all aspects of American culture, that just more reinforcing that same point that if you're planning to employ someone who's going to be a J1 employee, you definitely want to discuss not only with the J1 holder, but also with the program sponsor, what are the parameters of this program? What are the requirements? Like what exactly, how did this person qualify for the J1 and get this DS 2019 form? And how do we make sure that the training that we're giving to this employee is consistent with the program the person has been approved for? Yeah, so the slide just touches on the different facets that we've spoken about today, the J1 visa program stakeholders. We've discussed the Department of State. They oversee the program. They designate who can serve as a J1 program sponsor. The participants as well, it's advantageous for them. They're picking up professional skills. They're learning more about the American culture, perhaps developing their English language skills, and then applying those skills abroad. The host companies as well, so that's important. They're assisting by exposing the applicant to the American culture. Perhaps if this is a really skilled applicant, they're receiving a benefit in terms of what the applicant is bringing to the company in terms of ideas, in terms of workforce participation, et cetera. And then the sponsors, that's their main thing. They're facilitating the visa application process. Oftentimes, the sponsors, they're placing that J1 worker at a work site that allows them to meet the requirements of the program and stay compliant, but also assist that company in terms of the employment. And they're monitoring, the sponsors are monitoring, of course, the program to ensure compliance with the regulation and the basis for that J1 exchanges are having been approved for the J1 visa in the first place. Yeah, so interns and trainees, this is another one of the potential J1 categories that we've mentioned. This is similar to what we've discussed. You can't displace American workers in this type of situation. It's more meant as a substitute for ordinary employment. So let's say there is a special project, or maybe perhaps it's a project that involves understanding foreign culture, or understanding, being exposed to a foreign language, let's say, or something of that nature. Something like that would definitely, work very well. As with most other visa types, obviously at the completion of the program, the J1 holder has to return to their home country. So that's important. Similar to a J1, similar to an F1 visa, the J1 visa is not dual intent. So an H1B visa or an L1 visa, those are dual intent in the sense that the H1B or the L1 holder, it's completely fine for them to want to stay in the U.S. to pursue permanent residency, whereas J1, F1 visas, E3 visas for Australia, those are not dual intent in the sense that the person has to maintain an intent to return to their home country. So if a J1 visa holder was here and someone from USCIS asked them, like, oh, hey, do you want to stay here? Do you want to apply for a green card? And they say, oh, yes, I definitely do. That's a major problem because J1 is not a dual intent visa. So the person has to maintain an intent to return to their home country. So again, just with interns and trainees, again, they're assisting the J1 applicant with developing their practical skills and advancing their careers primarily abroad, because that's the point, that they're gaining these skills and they're applying this abroad. Yeah, just more on the intern and training programs. What are the different fields that these are often see a lot of these in research. Sometimes see them in business as well. There are very specific regulations in place where it's not very common in the medical field. I mean, that makes sense. Someone who's going to engage in medical work, generally they need a very high level of training. It doesn't make sense to allow someone here on a J1 visa to engage in like patient care and things of that nature. So these are the prohibitive, categories, social care, patient, contacting patients, medical care. So those are definitely, very, the clerical 20% of clerical are involved, the use of staffing agencies. Again, because that maybe takes away from the component of saying like, hey, this program is essential for this person to develop these skills and then apply them abroad. So they expect it to be a little bit more professional, and they generally do prohibit, someone engaging in medicine-related activities or medical treatment-related activities. Yeah, so this slide kind of just encapsulates for everyone, the different categories in terms of the length of time. Generally it's 18 months. 18 months is the length of the program. There are certain situations where the program sponsor can extend that, beyond the 18-month mark, depending on, the program and how that's, that's proceeding. So, with interns, it's a 12-month maximum program as well. There can be exceptions to that as well. If someone's at an academic institution, as well. Or being an intern, for example, being a recent graduate of a foreign institution and coming to the U.S. to serve as an intern, that's common as well. And those are situations as well where that particular country, their State Department could pay for that program. So they might say like, okay, this is someone who's just about to complete a program, here in Germany, or has just completed one. We want this person to go in the U.S. and receive stem cell training, let's say. Okay, so we'll pay for the J1 program, and this person is going to go through X sponsor and work at X hospital to obtain that exposure. So that's those are the different. And then again, the details that you're seeing on the side in terms of the 5 years of work experience or post-secondary degree from outside the U.S. and minimum 1 year post-graduation work experience. Those are the specific requirements for that particular category, the trainee. So that's not for every J1 holder. And perhaps what you see more commonly is this intern category on our left-hand side of the screen. Yeah. So just going on ahead with interns and trainees. It's what we've been discussing, developing their skills, applying those skills abroad. They are generally eligible for this after 2 years outside the U.S. One thing to keep in mind that a lot of J1 visas, what they have attached to them is a 2-year home residency requirement. So what that means is that, if someone completes a program, whether they receive government funding or whether they are on a special skills list in terms of that specific country, is that once they complete the J1 program, they have to return to their home country and not be there for the next 2 years. They wouldn't be able to stay in the U.S. There are exceptions to that rule. Seeking a J1 2-year home residency requirement waiver that exists as well, where the Department of State, working in conjunction with the government from that specific country where the employee is coming from, to say like, hey, we don't have objection to you waiving this 2-year home residency requirement. We feel that we have sufficient people in Germany who can perform the stem cell work, or we're fine with this particular individual proceeding on in the U.S. Without serving the 2-year home residency requirement. But in general, a J1 holder is expected to return to their home country. Yeah, and these, it's just what we've been discussing, the 2-year home residency requirement. You see that a lot. There are certain visa types. Someone who's subject to the 2-year home residency requirement, for example, they wouldn't be able to take on H-1B status until they have either met that 2-year home residency requirement, that they've left the U.S. for those 2 years, or that they've obtained a waiver. There are certain visa types that allow, and for example, an O1, extraordinary ability visa, that allows someone who's a J1 holder and who's subject to the 2-year home residency requirement, they are actually eligible to take on O1 status right away, assuming that they qualify for it, without first having served that requirement. But in general, if someone's subject to the 2-year home residency requirement, they're going to want to either seek a waiver of that requirement, or they're going to have to serve out that requirement in their home country. And that's what you can expect as well from the Department of State. That's and the Social Security. It's the same. Those same parameters that we've been discussing. Is that they do keep track of that, and there are also different requirements in terms of health insurance. So that has to be provided for the length of time that the J1 holder is inside the U.S. And of course, failing to meet these obligations, failing to meet the J1 sponsor requirements, that could lead to severe penalties, including not being able to sponsor any more future J1s in the future. Yeah, so the current Department of State, policies, And you guys are definitely aware of this as well, that you're seeing problematic situations in Turkey and Russia. Most recently in Turkey, they have restored the issuance program, but there was a period of time where the U.S. and Turkey mutually suspended, visa issuance. And so what we can, this slide kind of touches on the broader climate that we're seeing, today in the immigration world, in that there are a lot of people reporting security check delays at the consulates, reporting administrative check delays, and so we know that the travel ban, is in place, and it's a watered down version of what it initially was in terms of banning people from those 7 countries. But it's just something to be aware of, that if the person is from currently applying for a J1, or is potentially in a situation where there could be administrative checks and delays, whether it's for a J1 or any other person, just to not be surprised if there's 2 to 4 week delay, potentially could be even months for some people, depending on a lot of people from the Middle Eastern countries. As unfortunate as that sounds, they've been facing significant delays at the consulate. So this slide is just meant to advise them, whether it's a J1 or any other visa, that there are, since the start of last summer, there have been increased incidents of security check delays, administrative check delays, and those can last a couple weeks to even a couple months, unfortunately.
Yeah. All right, Gordy. What a great presentation. Very informative on the J1 visa. So yeah, as mentioned at the top of the presentation, now we'll kick it over to question and answer session. So again, if you would like to ask a question, please do so using the question function that you see on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll hopefully get to your question. And luckily, we have some rolling in right now. So Gordy, this individual, they're asking, he or she's asking, what is the difference between the F1 and the J1?
Yeah, absolutely. So that is a very common question. So F1, you see that, with students who are engaging in a full-time course of study. The difference is that, with J1s, oftentimes if that person is a scholar or student, their program is being paid for by the foreign country. One very important distinction is what we discussed on a previous slide, in that the dependent of an F1 holder is not permitted to obtain employment authorization. So an F2, which is a dependent to an F1, cannot work in the U.S., whereas a J2, who's dependent to a J1, can work in the U.S. So that's a very important distinction. A lot of foreign nationals, they often joke and say like, oh, the J1 is so much more humane than the F1 because it allows the dependent to work. But those are really the main distinctions. If we're speaking about scholars and students of J1 versus F1, the main distinctions are that for the J1, that program can often be paid by the foreign country, the foreign government. That can be a little bit dangerous as well, because that can make the J1 holder subject to the 2-year home residency requirement. So let's say Germany is saying, okay, John Doe, we'll pay for your master's program at Harvard, but once you complete that program, you have to come, back to Germany. That's why we're putting a 2-year home residency requirement on you. Whereas there's no such 2-year home residency requirement with F1 holders. So they're able to change to H1B or a different kind of work status. So that's one aspect that's advantageous in terms of F1s. And the vast majority of students are going to be F1s, but, you are going to encounter situations where someone's a J1, and that can be a little bit more of a unique situation.
All right, great. Thanks for that. So kind of piggybacking off of that, so the question is, J1 sounds great. What is the downside of this visa?
Yes. So the downsides of this visa is that the requirements from the Department of State in terms of who can serve as a program sponsor are, relatively unique. So for most of the HRs who are on this line, I don't want you to think like, okay, we're this company, we're going to become a J1 program sponsor and sponsor a bunch of J1s. It can have, if you have thoughts about that, certainly, that's something that, we could provide a general guidance on. But in general, the situations that you're going to find is that another company has sponsored that person's J1, like we mentioned on the DS 2019 form, say like, cultural vistas, and then they're working on site at your company as a J1 holder. So the downsides are that, it's for a temporary period of time. It's not dual intent, so really you're not supposed to pursue a green card as a J1 holder. There has to be, for most of the category, there has to be a heavy component of that cultural exchange program. And so the 2-year home residency requirement, that, is a certain downside in terms of a J1 holder having to either serve that out or obtain a waiver. So it's not an overly common visa type. It's not really, you don't see it too much with a lot of employers pursuing this, but that's the type of scenario that I think you guys will see it most often, where the person's on a J1 through cultural vistas, through a certain program sponsor, and then through that sponsor, part of that program allows them to work on site at a different company, and so that's one thing to be mindful of. And then the visa stamp in the DS 2019 form will say whether the person is subject to that 2-year home residency requirement. If they're not, that certainly opens it up to sponsoring that person for an H-1B or a different work visa type.
Gotcha. And we are getting a couple questions about the slides. So the recording will be emailed out, and in addition, there will also be a link to download the slides, so you will get both of these assets in the coming days. All right, Gordy, is there a grace period after a J1 holder has completed his or her program?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So there is a 30-day grace period. So that's, for F1 holders, for example, it's for H-1B holders, most recently 60 days. And so, that's the time that they're not, employment authorized, they finish the program, but they have that grace period. And most of the times as J1 holders, they use that time to perhaps, tour the U.S., to maybe if they found an offer of employment, to perhaps, apply for employment. But it's not, the type of 30 days where someone can, let's say, travel in and out of the U.S., and do that. So those 30 days are just meant for, for the J1 holder to finish out their period of stay in the U.S., maybe, if they're packing, et cetera. So it's a little bit, shorter than what it would be for an F1. F1 student has a 60-day grace period, so we know that. But yeah, for J1 holders, it's 30 days at the conclusion of the program.
Great. Mm-hmm. All right, this next question. If you get the approval of the 2-year waiver, beneficiary can change, let's see how this is worded. Beneficiary can go any other non-immigrant visa or immigrant visa? Yeah,
well, I think some of our audience maybe could be helped by the spell check function. No worries. It's a fine question. I'm glad that someone asked it. So the question is basically, if someone has received a waiver of the 2-year home residency requirement, are they allowed to change to any other non-immigrant visa? The answer is yes. They are. So as long as they qualify for that next visa, that would be absolutely proper. So basically, what a waiver of a J1 2-year home residency requirement is the Department of State and that particular country where the foreign national is coming from saying, okay, we know that when the person initially got into the program that we applied this 2-year home residency requirement, and we said that, John Doe was going to have to return to Germany to serve out these 2 years. But, we actually have a sufficient number of people working in the stem cell field. So, there's no objection to the 2-year home residency requirement being waived. That puts the J1 holder in a much freer situation. They can apply for different visa types. They can seek employment, et cetera. So, yeah, absolutely. If that 2-year home residency requirement is waived, not only does the person not have to return to their home country for those 2 years, they're also certainly eligible to apply for other non-immigrant visa types. Most of the times it's going to be the H-1B.
Gotcha. And so there's another question coming in. I've actually got quite a few of these. Does Envoy process J1 visas? Glad this question is brought up, and also to kind of reference this. So, no, Envoy doesn't process J1 visas. However, we can refer you to a partner, Cultural Vistas, which Gordy mentioned earlier. Additionally, like our app, you can track the status, track the J1, and then if you need help going toward another visa type, Envoy can help you with that. So a lot of different features there. So if you're interested in us referring you or tracking a J1, definitely feel free to contact Envoy. And we are getting a lot of other great questions. So getting to a couple more right now. So Gordy, can a program sponsor be a foreign university?
Usually it's not. It definitely is possible, but most of the times what you see is that the person is sponsored by, let's say, cultural research and maybe is placed at that university, but it definitely is possible. And a lot of universities, they have, kind of people, a legal team within that university that helps, issue J1 visas to students. So it's 100% possible. A lot of universities do it. You could see a different type of scenario where the person is sponsored by a different program sponsor is being placed at that university. But yeah, the vast majority of universities, what you're going to see is F1 visas, but J1s through a university are definitely very common. The main person to contact at that school who could facilitate something like that is the International Student Office. So they, definitely, handle that type of process.
Great.
Yeah, so there's an additional question about an employee going from a J2 EAD to an H1B visa without returning to their home country, being subject to the bar. Yeah, so it's that same discussion that we've been having. If the person has received a waiver of the 2-year home residency requirement, or if they're not subject to the 2-year home residency requirement at all, then yes, of course, they can switch from a J2 EAD to an H-1B visa without having, to return to their home country. So the key thing to look at, like, hey, how do we know if someone's subject to the 2-year home residency requirement? It should say on the visa stamp. So it'll say like subject to, 2-year home residency requirement, or on the DS 2019 form. Say like subject to, not subject to, so that's, it's the same parameters would apply in that regard.
Great. All right. Let's see. Just going through the questions here. Give us a couple seconds. We got a good one. Here's one. Are sponsors required to provide insurance during the 30-day prior and post-optional travel dates?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, that is being posed. In terms of what the actual regulation states, it states that they have to have that insurance during the actual course of the program. So in terms of the 30-day prior and post, that's not something that's specifically required by the regulation, but if it is a possibility, certainly for the program sponsor, then it's not something that we would discourage, just to ensure 100% full compliance.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so there's a question being posed about, once the J1 visa is completed, is it okay to apply for an L1 visa? Absolutely. If they meet the requirements of the L1, no question about it. If they've either served or if they've received a waiver of the 2-year home residency requirement, or if they're not subject to the 2-year home residency requirement, then yeah, absolutely. That's not an overly common scenario, but we do see it from time to time, someone switching from a J1 to an L1. So we have to remember that for an L1, one of the requirements is that the person has worked for a qualifying foreign entity of the U.S. employer for 1 full year in the 3 years prior to coming to the U.S. So if the person has applied for a J1 rather than an L1 in the first place, it's possible that they don't meet that requirement. And L1 visas these days at USCIS are definitely scrutinized pretty heavily. But no, it's definitely not prohibitive as long as there's no 2-year home residency requirement involved.
Gotcha. All right, Gordy. Well, I think we're going to end it there. There are some other questions that we weren't able to get to just given time restraints. So, we'll have someone reach out to you and hopefully answer your question. Again, Gordy, thank you so much for joining us today. Great presentation. And thank you, everyone, for dialing in and taking the time out today to join us. As another reminder, the recording and the slide deck will be emailed out to everyone who attended. So please keep an eye out on your inboxes in the coming days for links to download that. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.